The Bob Murphy Show, episode 179.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews, conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Bob Murphy Show. Today we're going to be talking with Nick Watts, who has a very interesting story. Nick's journey was he was at divinity school working on his master's thesis, and he wanted to seek out what does the Bible say about taxation, right? So, giving advice to political officials to say, hey, what's the biblically sound way to think about how you're going to tax your citizens? And he ended up with the radical conclusion that the Bible teaches not only that taxation is theft, which is sort of a libertarian slogan that's been going around for the last few years, but in fact, Nick goes further and says the Bible teaches that taxation is in fact slavery. And so his book that we'll be discussing is called Taxation is Slavery, the Biblical Case for Libertarian Politics. I want to just mention, even if you're not religiously inclined, I think you're going to get a lot out of this episode, that we talk about things like what was slavery like in the ancient world, the things like that I think you're going to enjoy even if you are not a believer yourself. So just as far as some of the official bio, Nick Watts completed a Master of Divinity degree at Queensland Theological College in Brisbane, Australia. While studying, he became interested in Christian approaches to politics. He decided to write his master's thesis on biblical principles for how a Christian politician should go about evaluating tax policy. And then, as I say, the rest is history. But again, I want to stress what's really interesting about this, and Nick will elaborate in the conversation we're about to go into here, that he didn't go into this project as a Rothbardian. He went in, as he puts it, sort of like someone in the same neighborhood as Ted Cruz or Ben Shapiro in terms of their political views. And he came out the other side as a Rothbardian type. So without further ado, here is my discussion with Nick Watts. Well, Nick, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Hey, Bob, great to be here.
So obviously we're going to focus on the content of your book, but can you just briefly give a little bit of background just so the listeners have an idea of, who you are and where you're coming from?
Yeah, so as it pertains to the book, I started Bible college in 2016. I went through to 2018, and I had to do a master's project for the end of that degree. And I went into it with some interest in kind of the intersection of Christianity and politics, and I decided taxes seemed like a really interesting question because it seemed really nuanced. So there were things I thought were seemingly obvious that Christian politicians should be for or against.
Mm-hmm.
But where should the tax level be? That seemed like you could dial it to a really, really fine level of detail. So how would you work that out? What would be a biblical principle? And I thought if I could answer that, I'd probably get some fundamental principles to answer just about all the other questions that a Christian politician might ask. So I'll write a project on that. And I went into it as kind of a Ted Cruz, Stephen Crowder, Ben Shapiro type of conservative.
Mm-hmm. And
then I started doing all the reading. And by the time I was a month or two into the reading, I was like, oh dear, I think I'm an Ancap. So it was a really rapid progression there.
And, okay, well,
I had
great.
to rethink how I was going to structure the essay.
Uh-huh. So is your book the thesis, or you did your thesis and then you did the book based on that?
So I did the thesis. That was about 8,000 words, and that was all based. The thesis was really geared around Abraham Kuyper, who was kind of a limited government principled, limited government Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, I have a lot of material here that really doesn't fit into that Abraham Kuyper paradigm. I need to make a book out of this. So the book is kind of based on the thesis research.
Okay, and the book is called Taxation is Slavery?
Yep.
Okay.
Which was the conclusion of my thesis.
Right. Okay, so yeah, to let the listeners know where we're going with this. So can I just push you a little bit? Because that opening, and folks, he emailed me pitching this idea, and I thought, wow, I've never heard a story like that before. So, because there's plenty of people who have made the case that anarcho-capitalism is consistent with Christianity, or even that, like, if you really understand the principles and whatever, that, the true Christian should be an Ancap and so on. But what I really liked about your issue is that you started out as a sort of right-wing conservative type, and then, minarchist, let's say, at the very most. And
Not
it was
quite.
from reading the...
I think I had to go through a step through minarchism on the way.
Oh, okay. So you were even more of a, towards the statism. And so, but it wasn't that you, if I understand it wasn't that you went out, like you happened to be Christian, and then you were reading Rothbard and Lysander Spooner, and then they converted you, and then you had to reconcile that with your Christianity. It was actually going to the Bible, just trying to understand, how does the Bible, what does it teach us about taxation, that actually you pushed you in that direction? Is that what happened?
Pretty much. So I think I started off with a friend years before had introduced me to Abraham Kuyper.
Mm-hmm.
Just for listeners who don't know, he was the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, but he was also a Calvinist Christian theologian.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote an essay called, I think it's just called Calvinism and Politics. And I sort of started with that. I thought, this guy, he's a Calvinist theologian, he was a politician, he must have thought this through.
Mm-hmm.
And probably he's already got this great framework for it, and I'm just going to study that. And the more I studied it out, the more I thought, there's some deep inconsistencies here, I just can't reconcile it. And I met a guy who actually mentioned to me in passing that he was an anarchist, and I thought, that's really bizarre, because I knew he was a Reformed Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, don't we, Romans 13, we have to have some taxes and this kind of thing. So I said, can you recommend me anything at all to read on that angle? And he said, yeah, go check out Mises.org. And it was all downhill from there, really. And he told me to start with Bastiat. And so I started reading Bastiat,
mm-hmm.
and that took me a lot of the way. That kind of brought me as far as, okay, this minarchism thing makes sense, but like even Bastiat kind of leaves some room for military and police type things to be done by the state. And so I thought, well, I'll come that far. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought this, even Bastiat, he's just, why isn't he an anarchist? I don't understand why he doesn't take that last step. I can't find a way to reconcile this, but it seems like anarchism can't be the right answer because of some stuff in the Bible. I think I eventually read Rothbard's Ethics of Liberty, and I think that made me rethink some stuff and made me go, hold on, maybe this could be done. Maybe this isn't absolutely a pipe dream. And he's sort of describing private defense agency type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And, crime insurance and all that kind of thing. I went, okay, hold on. There was also, I can't remember who wrote it. There's a thing out there on the internet called The Obviousness of Anarchy.
I don't think I've seen that.
I found it via YouTube, and the whole premise of it was kind of, there is a lot of anarchy going on around you right now. You just don't realize it. Mm-hmm. There's heaps of private security that exists. It's not like the state actually has a monopoly on security. Private security is everywhere. So let's just, if it's whatever percentage of security it is now, let's just keep expanding that until it's everything.
Mm-hmm.
We've proven these things work. Let's just have more of them. And it was just kind of a different way of thinking. And I guess that kind of gave me permission to explore some of the inconsistencies that I've been struggling with. I felt like, if I come out the other end and if anarchism is what makes sense from the text, I'm not insane. That's
okay. So
I don't.
So is it true? I realize now what actually happened is a little bit different from what I thought you were originally saying. So was it like a simultaneous thing? Like while you were working on the thesis in the text and reading Bible commentaries, you were also reading this other stuff that the Mises.org.
Yeah, so
okay.
Both all the way. And I was reading Christian Socialists and things at the same time as well.
Okay.
And it was more just it was a meeting of the minds kind of thing, really, where I'd already come to the conclusion, look, what makes sense in the text is that taxes are slavery. The Bible talks about them as slavery. It uses the language of slavery to describe them everywhere consistently. That's what it is. But if that's the case, how on earth do I reconcile these things in the New Testament that tell you to obey the emperor? And I think seeing that anarcho-capitalism was not just a pipe dream insanity, I felt like that gave me some kind of permission to really explore what I thought must already be right just from the text.
Okay, so if I understand you, was it something like this, that is you study the Bible, and folks, don't worry, I will let him make the case, how does the Bible say taxes or slavery? But let's assume for the moment, stipulate that, okay, and then you were struggling with, but wait a minute, I know that we need taxes to support the modern political state with all of its important functions, and we don't like what the state does in practice, but at least textbook, blah blah blah. And so, how can this be? Like, how could the Bible be saying it's slavery? Does that mean either I'm wrong in thinking that it's saying that, or is the Bible saying slavery is necessary? Well, that's weird. And so Rothbard et al. Showed you, no, you don't need taxation for a functioning society. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's jump in then. So how is it? How does the Bible? So I'll let you make the case, and then there's some obvious objections I can imagine a Christian who believes in at least a limited state bringing up.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess the place that I would start is, I don't know, there's a few different ways you can come at it, but the first and simplest, I think, is just to look at the language that gets used in the Greek and the Hebrew again and again. We see just the language of slavery used to describe taxes. I think one of the really key ones is 1 Samuel 8, so where Israel is going to get their first king. So what I think people kind of overlook a little bit is that for centuries there, between kind of Moses and then Saul and the Davidic kings, Israel didn't have a king, and they didn't have taxes in the most kind of common sense. You might argue some certain things about the temple and contributions to the temple and priesthood and that sort of thing. I go into a nuanced discussion of where all that fits in the book, but leaving that aside for a moment, they didn't have a king per se. They didn't have someone like David or Solomon who was actually charging them taxes. And they got by like that for centuries. And the time of the judges had serious problems, but it did have periods of peace. And it didn't just collapse in less than a century and into absolute chaos. But then they get a king, and what God says to them through the prophet Samuel is, if you institute this king, he will
Nick,
take a
can
tenth
I
of
stop you
everything.
just for a second? For the benefit of the listeners who are vaguely familiar with this, so you're saying Moses famously leads the Israelites out of slavery from Egypt.
Out of Egypt.
They wander for 40 years. They get into the promised land. And then they know at some point, and then King David comes along. But you want to stress there was a long period in between there where, the people of Israel were the 12 tribes. They were up and running, but there was no one, there was no state apparatus for sure. There was like a religious hierarchy.
Exactly.
And hence there was no taxation.
So there was
formally.
leadership. Yeah, there was governance, we might say, but not government.
Right, and this was the period of judges.
Yeah,
okay.
So they had judges, but judges did not exact taxes.
Right.
And again, I had kind of show that in some detail through the book. At one point, they try to get Gideon to become the king, and he refuses. No, I'm not going to do that. He'll be the judge, but he won't be the king. He won't exact taxes. Anyway, when they do ask finally for a king, God says through the prophet Samuel, look, if you have a king, he'll take a tenth of all your stuff and you will be his slaves. That is the language that God uses. You'll be his slaves. And that was kind of a turning point for me, just to kind of see that there on the page and kind of trace that through, and sort of went, okay, that does carry through. So throughout further into the Old Testament, when David or Solomon, when they conquer an area, when they, fight off a foreign nation and conquer them, that nation pays them taxes and becomes their slaves. That's, that language always goes hand in hand. They became their slaves and paid tribute. And that's something that carries through into the New Testament even. There's a point where Jesus is talking to Peter. And
hey Nick,
Jesus,
sorry to stop you, but I just want to make sure I'm catching you. Are you saying that, to say they became their slaves and paid tribute, like you're saying, that, how do we know they were their slaves? Oh, because look they keep sending them periodic money. In other words, that's that's the outward sign that we know they're in subjection and are slaves. In other words, it's not that they were bound in chains and were taken back to and were picking, fruit or something. It was that they had to keep sending this money, or else troops were going to show up and kill some people.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's good point to clarify. The point I kind of make through a lot of that section of the book is the text of the Old Testament uses this language. It says, I've got one of them right here, 1 Chronicles 18:2. And he defeated Moab, and the Moabites became slaves to David and brought tribute.
Mm-hmm.
That's how the text phrases it.
Mm-hmm.
But clearly from context, what it means is they keep bringing regular
right.
tribute funds.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that someone's standing over them, cracking a whip, forcing them to work on particular things.
Right.
They are forced to bring regular tribute, and that means that they are slaves. That makes them slaves.
Right. Okay.
And that language carries through to the New Testament. Jesus uses the language of slavery and freedom to describe the tax that he and Peter pay. It's an obscure story in the New Testament, but there's a point where temple officials are asking Peter, "Hey, does Jesus pay the tax here?" And Jesus says, "Look, I don't have to pay the tax because it's my Father's house and I'm a son. Sons are free. Taxes are paid not by free people but by the slaves." So again, that language is just consistent. And other places in the New Testament where paying taxes is discussed, the language of slavery is right there beside it. Into the church fathers, we see particularly, I think, Tertullian makes this point that he sarcastically says, Caesar, if he was going to take over heaven, what would taking over heaven look like? It would look like Caesar trying to impose a tax on heaven.
That's what the church father says?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this consistent thing through Old Testament, New Testament church fathers. They just identify paying taxes with being enslaved by a foreign king in a foreign nation.
Okay, and
or
so
the local king.
And so not only tell me if this violates your theological, but I would say not only did God the Father in the Old Testament tell the Israelites, if you want to be free, you wouldn't pay taxes. So are you sure you want a king? Right?
Yeah.
But then also
So
Jesus, the Son, what I meant with the theology was calling the God of the Old Testament the Father. And then Jesus the Son in the New Testament reiterates that and says, I don't owe a tax because I'm free, and only people who aren't free would actually owe it. But then he also then tells, is that the one where he goes into gets it out of the fish's mouth?
That's the one.
Okay.
So he chooses to pay it, but he says, I don't have to, but so as not to give offense to them, go and get a coin out of the fish's mouth and pay it for both of us. So he sort of takes this, let's not make waves approach, but let me be clear, I don't have to pay that. The sons are free.
Okay, great. Okay, so is there more you want to say? I mean, I think you've pointed out enough. Do you have more you want to say, or should we move to? Okay, so
that's probably enough for now.
Okay, so then, I mean, obvious stuff. There's certain passages. I mean, every April 15th, I go to I think it's BibleGateway.com. I go to a website that has like a verse of the day, and they always say, and this is why you pay taxes. And it's every April 15th, keeping us, all right. I'm a good Christian, and I may not like it, but this is why we do it. And so, how do you? I mean, that's the standard objection someone's going to bring up: is doesn't the Bible clearly say, this is the reason we pay taxes?
Yeah, and so that's the elephant in the room always with this discussion is Romans 13. And so I made a deliberate choice to start the book with that passage, just knowing anyone who knows anything already about the subject, that's going to be the critical thing.
In fact, let me
start from there, unpack the problem, and then
let me pull it up. Do you happen to have it in front of you, or should I pull it up?
I do.
Okay, yeah. Can you actually just say, because we're assuming everybody knows it verbatim, can you just go ahead and read it just so everyone knows exactly what we're grappling with?
Sure.
Please.
So this is Romans 13, 1-7. It says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For the same reason, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed."
Okay, so prima facie, it looks tough if you're telling me the Bible says taxation is theft. So how do you? So like I said, I think there's two routes. One is you could say you're wrong in thinking that taxation is theft from the Bible, or two is the Bible is endorsing slavery. And to be fair, there are other passages people get mad and say there are places too where Paul does seem to, talking like masters be nice to your slaves, that kind of stuff. So it is true even that the Bible doesn't in some places seem like it's going to overturn slavery in an earthly sense.
Yeah. So I think one of the big things I bring out very early in the book is just I do a chapter on when the Bible talks about slavery, what's it talking about, and try to make a very important distinction between conquest slavery versus contract slavery.
Right.
So there are people who are slaves because they've entered into like a debt repayment contract. It's for a limited time or until they've paid off a debt, that sort of thing, and that is okay. That is not considered immoral or unethical in the Bible. It's sort of considered an undesirable state to be in, but it's not immoral.
Right.
So you can, I think there's a real sense in which you could call a mortgage a slavery contract.
Right.
It's a debt repayment. You're working for someone else.
Right. Just like if
that's not what we're talking about.
And
there's conquest slavery where the king rolls into town, puts the sword to everyone, and says, you've got to start bringing tribute. That's obviously wildly immoral.
Right. Just like to give
so you got to distinguish between those things.
To give the listeners an example, like way back, if someone was in Europe and wanted to go to the New World, and it was way too expensive, some 20-year-old guy, and he couldn't afford the passage, and he might if he said to the ship captain, "Okay, can you take me over there? And then once we get there in the new colony or whatever settlement, I'll work for you for 3 years. You got me a room and board because I got to live." But so that in a sense, that is the kind of thing you're saying that certain passages of the Bible, that's what they're calling what is being translated as like master slave or bond servant might be a more neutral term.
That's the thing, yeah.
Okay.
That's the thing in English. You see the language of slave or servant or bond servant in the ESV, I think it is. But it's actually in the Greek, it's all the same. It's all just slave.
Okay. All right.
So I think that nuance is definitely there. Yeah, like you really, again, like just I unpack this in quite a bit of detail in the book. You can tell from context these are very different things. The Bible is extraordinarily against conquest slavery in a vehement way.
Right.
But not contract slavery. So, like for instance, Jacob wants to marry Rachel. He's one of the Old Testament patriarchs, so he works for 7 years for her father in lieu of a dowry. It's a contract slavery set up in payment of this dowry he wants to provide. So that kind of thing is very different to Caesar rolling in. Israel is now under the Roman Empire. Start paying up.
Okay, so I kind of derailed you there, took you down on a cul-de-sac. But so the main thing is,
no, that's good.
Paul,
that's important.
In Romans 13, as you just read there a minute ago, so Paul seems like he's saying, pay taxes, and so how do you grapple with that?
Yeah. So that's kind of probably the toughest question in the book. And I think the way I came at it was to actually start with a couple of other New Testament passages first to show something that's going on. So those are 1 Peter and Titus that both actually kind of say similar things, honor the emperor, give respect, pay the taxes, that sort of thing. But in those other passages, it's much more, just one verse away from slaves obey your earthly masters. It's, there's this very clear connection that the reason you submit to Caesar and pay the taxes is the same reason that slaves submit to their masters. And if you look a bit more carefully at Romans, you see that Romans 13 comes at the end of Romans 12. Romans 12 is this continual progression of love your enemies, do good to those who persecute you, pray for them. And at the end of this increasingly strong set of calls to love your enemy, the cherry on top of that is submit to the emperor, pay the taxes. So I think if you read that all as, chapter 12 and 13 as a whole, instead of what we usually do is, pay too much attention to the chapter break there and start with just 13. Right. If you read that as a progression, suddenly I think it makes a lot more sense. You see that what Romans 13 is really doing is giving you the kind of ultimate application of what I've called tactical pacifism.
Right.
That if you're stuck in the position of a slave, you can choose to be submissive and love your master and do good to him and overcome evil with good. And so it's the same thing we see with like Daniel and Nehemiah in the Old Testament when Israel gets conquered and they get shipped off into slavery. they go before this king who has conquered them, but they wish them long life and good health. And Nehemiah goes before Artaxerxes and says, may the king live forever. And he operates as a servant in the household.
Right.
It's that kind of thing. It's choosing to be submissive and loving in spite of what's being done to you.
Okay. And by the way, Nick, you're not the first person I've heard say that when we read Romans 13, you need to realize it comes after Romans 12, which makes sense. And so reading that whole thing, it does, at least seeing the context helps. But still, having said all that, I mean, it's some of that language in there, about for this is why, God's put them in charge. And, hey, it sounds like he's saying if you haven't done anything wrong, the ruler's not going to bother you any. And so on the face of it, that is a weird thing to say because Paul at various points was in prison for proclaiming Christ. Yeah. And so clearly, it's sort of a weird thing where like he couldn't possibly mean what it sounds like he's saying. And we're not just doing that because of our Rothbardianism, just because just knowing his history, he obviously knows that it's, Herod's not someone who hasn't ever sinned in his life.
You and I and Paul know that
right.
You do sometimes have things to fear from the state, even if you're doing the right thing.
Right. So I don't know. Do you want to speak to that a little bit? I mean, I've heard different theories that, he was having to be cool to get the message out subtly, or when he says, for example, give taxes to whom they're owed. If you don't think you owe taxes to anybody because you're an anarchist, well then, you see what I'm saying? Like it's kind of a clever...
Yeah.
So how do you feel about
it?
It
is definitely possible that there's some subtlety going on there with the context because you have to remember that Paul is writing this when the Roman Empire is very much in power. Mm-hmm. And he's writing it to Christians in Rome who are, I think at this point, there's already been this expulsion of the Jews from Rome. I think I've got the timeline right there. Maybe don't quote me on that. I'm having to dig back into the college days. But there is a real threat of persecution for the Christians in Rome from the Roman authorities, and so Paul, knowing that anyone might intercept this letter and open it up, there is the possibility that he's being deliberately a bit cautious about exactly what he says in it, and trying to make the case that look, we are not here to rock the boat, we're not here to overturn Rome. We're citizens who can be relied on not to cause trouble. And he may even be sort of playing that angle a bit more strongly than he otherwise would just because of that context.
Right.
That is a real possibility. I don't know if I want to be dogmatic or conclusive about it, but it is worth kind of bearing in mind.
Okay.
I think the other,
Okay, so just
we see that actually also in the Church Fathers. Tertullian says that very explicitly. He's kind of pretty open about the fact that, the Roman state is the enemy of the church and of the believers, but we submit to it anyway because we're Christians and we love our enemies. That's what we do. That's how we roll.
Right. And also the earlier passage with Jesus and Peter and the temple tax just epitomizes that, right? So that's another, feather in your cap for the position you're trying to take is that. So if I get what you're saying Paul in Romans 13 is not contradicting your claim that the Bible says taxes are theft. He's just saying if someone is stealing from you, like, a standard Christian would probably say if there's a mugger who comes up and says, give me your wallet, and your only choices are to give him the wallet or to shoot him in the head, a lot of Christians would probably say, really, if you really want to go above and beyond, just give him the money rather than having to kill the guy.
Yeah. Here's my wallet and here's my watch. God bless you.
Right.
That's a legitimate Christian thing to do.
and clearly Jesus there in the earlier passage we discussed says, I don't owe this tax. So in a sense, if someone thought, someone pointed a gun at him and said, you got to pay this tax, or back then it wouldn't be a gun, but if they were going to club him, sword, then he that would be clearly theft, right? If taking it from him.
Yeah.
But he's saying, I choose to pay it, so as not to give offense or so on, to ruffle feathers because, his purpose there is for something else. It's not to overturn temple taxation policies.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And just to drive that point home, one of the things when I started doing the biblical study, one of the things I went looking for is there any case in the Bible of someone refusing to pay a tax? Does that come up ever in the Bible? And I found actually, yes, it does. Mm-hmm. There's two cases in Judges that are really, I think, the big clear ones, which are Ehud and Gideon. Mm-hmm. under Ehud, Israel's been conquered by, let me get this right, it's the Moabites. Israel's been conquered by the Moabites. Eglon's the king of Moab, and Ehud gets delegated to take Israel's tribute to Eglon, and he goes there and he assassinates the king and kind of ends the whole tribute tax relationship. And, whatever you might call that, it's not pacifism.
Right.
He's not choosing the tactic of pacifism there. He's assassinating the king who's asking for taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is Gideon, who leads a revolt. And when we meet Gideon, it says he's beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. So he's sort of engaged in tax evasion.
Just for listeners who don't know that, can you spell that last one out a little bit? I know what you're talking about, but can you spell that out?
Yeah. So tribute and taxes might not always be paid in money, particularly that early in history. Exactly what was being used as the money is in a bit of flux. So soldiers might turn up and demand tribute, but the tribute might just be, a portion of the wheat harvest or, a portion of the cattle flock or whatever it is. So, part of what Gideon is doing when we meet him, and the first thing we're told about Gideon is that he's beating out wheat in the winepress. He's, instead of beating it out openly in the field, he's doing his wheat production stuff, in this hidden, secluded, tucked away place inside the winepress to make sure that the Midianites can't come and take his wheat.
Right. Okay.
Can't come and take their cut.
Mm-hmm.
So there are these acts of overt tax evasion and rebellion in the Old Testament, and they're sanctioned by God. God sends Gideon.
Right.
So, I'm left thinking to myself, my big question, I think, going in was, how do I reconcile that with what Paul says in Romans 13? How on earth can I put those together? That was probably my biggest biblical tension.
Right. Since we're talking about Romans 13, let me just throw out two of the points that I make about this, particularly when I'm dealing with like Christian conservative types. And so one is, I'll say, like, because they'll be like, oh yeah, you libertarians, you think taxation's, well, they just, you don't like tax, or, but come on, Romans 13, the authorities are put there by God. And I'll say to them, if I'm talking to U.S. conservative types who are religious, I'll say, well, wait a minute. Yeah. The United States government went and overthrew Saddam Hussein's regime. Wasn't Saddam put there by God to, the Kurds, as long as they didn't do anything evil, they had nothing to fear from Saddam. So who are we to interfere? And so whatever argument they give me to explain that, I could just as well say, okay, so you at least admit in principle, not all earthly governments you agree nobody can mess with, that all regimes are sacrosanct because God put them there, right? And then once they give that, and I say, okay, by your own law, you guys always tout the Constitution and everything, like that's your favorite book ever written except the Bible. And so the U.S. government clearly isn't following the Constitution. So under any metric, as long as you've already admitted the principle that not all governments just deserve to always be upheld, so I'll go that route with them. But the other thing I'll mention is, and this is part of your evolution, how you said like Rothbard and those people like sort of gave you permission to entertain this train of thought, is clearly when Paul was writing this stuff, he didn't have in mind competing defense agencies and arbitration procedures and blah, blah. You know what I mean? It's not like he had Robert Nozick on the back shelf and he was like, yeah, this guy nailed it, and that's why I'm not an Ancap. So I think partly like what he's calling like the word government in a broad enough sense, I'm not against government either. I'm like, that's actually why I say, Nick, like I'm against the state, to be more specific, because government could just mean.
I try to consistently use the language "the state" in the book for
okay,
that
great. Yes, you've seen that as well too, because there's a sense. So, because certainly there would be law in a Rothbardian type world, and so you could even say there would be government if by what you mean by government is, are there'd even be authorities in the sense like, hey, Richard Feynman is an authority in physics, and in that sense, there'd be legal experts and whatever. So. Partly, I could just argue, and I've seen people say this too, that in Romans 13, what he's saying is like the just authorities, and to them it's owed. And so, in an Ancap world, if you sign contracts and then the reputable judges and they rule it, somebody said, hey, this guy didn't follow the contract, and a judge ruled against you, you really ought to pay what the court said there, because that's what the law says, and that's the context. Whereas, if it's a criminal organization that's the state, just because they say they're the law, that doesn't mean they are. Is that kind of thing. And the way I drive it home is, if Paul saw the modern United States, or even, the United States in 1950 or whatever, like, what conservatives love, he wouldn't say right on, guy. He'd probably say, you let women vote? Are you out of your minds? That's not, you see what I mean? So he's clearly, when he's writing there in Romans, is his idea, right? His idea of what proper government looks like is not, we would say we have the advantage of all sorts of philosophy and whatever since then. And so I'm saying it's conceivable. One way you can reconcile it, and I don't think you're just grasping at straws, is to say, yeah, what Paul means by a just government and the proper authorities to whom tribute is owed would be like the regular court system in an Ancap world. And yeah, if the judge said you have a dispute, you bring it to the judge and he says, okay, here's my fee. Well, you got to pay that, because the judges do that. Anyway, how do you feel about that stuff? Is that...
Yeah, like I got a lot of nuanced thoughts on that. I said the back end of the book has actually quite a detailed discussion of government in Israel during the time of the judges, and really draws out this idea that there's really what's the difference really between a judge and a king in the biblical context, and there's really not much except for taxes.
Really?
The judge kind of mediates disputes and leads the army in battle when Israel gets invaded, and provides kind of those same services that the king provides, except that he doesn't take taxes. He doesn't take involuntary payments. That's kind of the key distinction. And there's a whole reason for that. Like you see in 1 Samuel 8, the reason they're asking for a king is because some of the judges are corrupt. The judges are taking bribes. And the rationale seems to be, well, if we have a king and he can just take whatever he wants from anyone at any time, he's completely insusceptible to bribery.
Oh, yeah.
How could you bribe someone who can have anything they want? And that'll just solve that problem. We'll just have a king like everyone else. And I think, God's message through Samuel is kind of, this is going to backfire. This is not as good an idea as you think. You'll be slaves.
Okay, it's funny because I was going to say to you, well, but gee, it's not just the, he talks about like all the horses and the this and the that and the but I guess your point is right. The king can afford that and the judge can't because the king has the taxation power. So that's why he has all the big entourage and all that stuff that goes with it. Okay.
And there's really this idea that before they have a human king, God is their king. So it's not even that they strictly don't have a king. It's just that God is their king. And he even uses the language of, look, Israel are my slaves. And that's part of why they, pay certain fees and things at the temple. There's a poll tax that they pay at the temple that is really to God because God is their king. So that, it's it's a difficult thing to categorize. Pre-monarchical Israel. Do you say it's an anarchist society? Kind of. Well, they sort of have God as a king. They have judges that ultimately there is kind of a monopolized final Supreme Court of Appeal at the temple. So it's not a totally decentralized judicial system, but it's not it's pretty close.
Right. Okay, so you raised two interesting points there. In terms of classifying, I think a lot of people say, oh, it's a theocracy. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
But are you saying that's not specific enough?
There's a bunch of things left out of that, right? Because you might call an Islamic caliphate a theocracy, and it's a very different thing.
Sure. Right.
That's there's a lot of detail that you miss by just using the word theocracy.
Right. Okay.
Although that is accurate.
Right. I gotcha. And then this issue of what I've done, I at some point, Nick, I stopped volunteering that I was an anarchist. So if I'm like at a libertarian event and somebody says, hey, Dr. Murphy, are you an anarchist? I'll say yes because I know what they mean. They mean as opposed to a minarchist or whatever, and so I'll say, but I don't volunteer precisely because I say, well, technically I have a king, Jesus, and so that would make me a monarchist. So I don't say I'm a monarchist either because that would confuse people too, but I will say that, I'm a voluntarist perhaps or something like that or, So
I've taken to using the language of voluntarist as well, and because I think it just opens the conversation on such a better note and really gets at the heart of how are my political views different to yours. It's because I believe in doing everything voluntarily.
Right, exactly. Not to mention the historical baggage of
last time we had an election here in Australia, we have mandatory voting. We get fined if we don't go and vote. It's very different. But I rocked up there so I wouldn't have to pay the fine. But I wore a T-shirt with it has like the anarchist A, but with a Christian cross through, and it says "No King but Christ."
Okay, nice.
And that's kind of how I come at it. In a sense, anarchy, but really divine monarchy is what I'd like to call it, rather than again to subtly distinguish from what people think of as theocracy. I prefer the term divine monarchy, but I made that up so no one else knows what I mean.
Right. That's good. I mean, part of the fun of being an anarcho-capitalist is that very few people know what that means. But
Yeah.
so we're even more exclusive. Say something that even the standard Rothbardian says, "What are you talking about?" So just to push that a little bit. So is it correct then to maybe one way of putting it is the reason God doesn't want the Israelites to embrace an earthly king is not only because, hey, that's a bad idea, it's going to go poorly for you, but you're usurping me. I'm really your guy's king, and by you embracing the earthly, you're just copying the pagans, and you're forgetting me.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a real sense in which you can see. There's this idea in biblical theology that you can trace a theme all the way through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and by tracing the theme through, you get a bunch of richness out of it. Doesn't mean that you don't see everything. Like you can trace the theme of like sacrifice all the way through, or you can trace the theme of in our case, what is a king all the way through. And one of the things I tried to do in the book was kind of show the gospel from Genesis to Revelation through the lens of who is going to be king. So, start out with God as king. People move into having, they reject him in the garden, obviously, but move into having human kings. And there's this whole tension of when are God's people going to have God as their king again? And then Jesus comes and just, kind of reconciles all of that. They're going to have a human king, Jesus, who's also God, their king. He puts it all together, and that's kind of how it all gets fixed. That's the gospel solution to this problem of humanity not having God as their king. And this really comes to a head when the people come to crucify Jesus. And I think Pilate says to them, shall I crucify your king? And the crowds cry out, we have no king but Caesar. It's like this moment of just stark rejection of, we won't have God as our king. We'll have Caesar instead. Caesar is the idol. And that all gets kind of fleshed out in the last chapter of the book. I try to really end on that gospel note.
And so sort of like,
so I think that,
like, notice, guys, in your zeal to kill Jesus, look what you ended up saying. Like, that's not a coincidence that,
Exactly.
By the way, that was what you just said there was gorgeous. I mean, once you said it, I realized, that was staring me in the face. I never thought of that before, that among other things, when Jesus comes, but he reconciles the humans. Say, no, we want a man as our king. And God's saying, well, really, it should be me. And then Jesus fixes that. That's awesome. I've never
that whole tension in 1 Samuel 8 is resolved when Jesus comes, and every other tension of the Old Testament, really.
So can I ask you, just as a practical question, I'm not sure if the Bible gets into this, or if obviously you've been reading other things too. So did the judges, so my understanding is the judges did not make law. They were just trying to apply the law that, Moses gave them from God, obviously.
Yeah.
Did the kings make law, or were they also technically, or at least what they were supposed to be doing, was just interpreting the applying the law to specific cases, or did they engage in what Hayek would call legislation?
I don't think I could answer this really in a lot of detail. I haven't tried to really flesh out thoughts on this, but definitely the kings kind of legislate as far as at least, what are their taxes going to be? The kings didn't all have the same tax rates, and they didn't tax all the same things. So at least as far as that aspect of their laws, they were different to one another. Different generations. Solomon was known for putting pretty heavy taxes on Israel, and then his son comes up, and to kind of prove that he's just as solid of a king as his father, he says, I'm going to impose even a heavier burden just to show that I'm an even bigger.
Well, what's interesting is, given what you said so far, since God didn't want them to have an earthly king, it's almost like they would have to just start improvising, because the law from God, the Mosaic law, would not have provided. Now, an earthly king is going to tax capital gains at this much up to the cost basis and blah blah blah, and so that in terms of where did this idea come from, that people the rulers just start making stuff up and saying, oh, this is the law. Like, you could say that's, in this case, it came in the back door via taxation.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because for Israel specifically, the Mosaic law does have limitations on the power of the king. It says, the king must not do this, must not do that. It does kind of make provision for, you might choose to have a human king in the future. That's something foreseen in the Mosaic law.
Right.
But there are certain limits on it, because God will still ultimately be king. The human king of Israel will only ever be subordinate, and they'll have certain powers. And I even go into that I think the king of Israel specifically, in contrast to most other kings, does have the kind of legitimate authority to tax. That is legitimately delegated to that king through a contract, I think.
Okay, so maybe I jumped the gun then. Maybe I misspoke. So I don't want to put words in your mouth. Are you saying?
So virtually every other king conquers by conquest, and that's totally illegitimate.
Okay.
But Israel's a very special case where I think there is a contract involved in setting up king's power.
Because they wanted Saul to be their king.
Yeah.
So God said, all right, you guys want a king. I'm telling you through Samuel, this is a mistake, but okay, this guy Saul, he's going to be your king. And they wanted it. So Saul didn't conquer Israel. Is that what you're getting at?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So, and because of that, the contract has certain stipulations, limitations, and the king should not amass a certain size army. Not that they always obey this, but that's, in the Mosaic law, they shouldn't amass an army over a certain size because God is meant to be who fights for them, and it's sort of an act of faith.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm trying to remember how we got on that train of discussion.
I don't know if this is how far back, because originally when you had said the one distinction between the judges and the king was taxation, I thought, well, wait, is a different one too legislation? And so I had asked you, does the king make laws different from how the judges just interpreted and applied the law?
Yes, in practice, the kings definitely did that, I think. Whether, how much they should have been doing that is another question.
Right.
But they essentially just operate like the pagan kings who were a law unto themselves and made whatever laws they wanted at any time for any reason. Mm-hmm. Especially the bad kings of Israel are very much like that. But I think the goal for the judges and the kings, but definitely for the judges, was that you would have the natural law, that the moral law of God that existed before Moses ever came, before Exodus and Deuteronomy. There's hundreds of years where it's just Genesis on, where there really is no sense of God has said all the little 600 some odd laws that are in the Old Testament. That's not in existence yet. People still knew what was right and wrong. That's all from the natural law, and Israel's law through Moses is really just a particular concrete implementation of that natural law in a concrete society. And so then the judge's goal is to take the kind of the case law, the set of case law that God provides through the Mosaic law, and build on that. Mm-hmm. So God kind of sets up a common law system with this set of existing case law from Moses, and the judges kind of start with that as their base. That's all their precedents that they use to judge new cases.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. If we can now pivot the remaining 15 or so minutes we have here, let me just find it in the email. You said, I noticed in a previous episode you're interested in intelligent design, and you said that you connected the research of ID theorists. So, folks, ID stands for intelligent design. ID theorists with the Lockean and Rothbardian notion of homesteading. So can you expand on that? Because that sounded pretty interesting.
Yeah, so before I did theology stuff, my earlier education was in computer science, and I got really interested in intelligent design stuff while I was doing that. I was actually at one point looking to write a master's about how to quantify information in a computer system, and then to try and apply that to kind of biological systems and information stored in the DNA, and try to go down that whole intelligent design route. Then I found a book by a guy named Werner Gitt that I thought, this is actually better than anything I was going to write as a thesis, so I'm just not going to bother. Mm-hmm. So that was excellent. But I got really interested in that whole space. And as I was kind of contemplating this whole idea of homesteading and stuff Locke said about, once you transform a resource out of the state of nature, it becomes private property, I was kind of reflecting on this, all the reading I'd done about kind of philosophically what happens in intelligent design. And I thought I think these are actually kind of talking about the same thing. Briefly, I think to understand the world, you have to understand it in terms of three fundamental quantities. Most people in science will talk about matter and energy. There's really a third, which is information. Mm-hmm. A book is something different to a pile of paper and ink. The organization of material things makes them into something different than what they were. Just the sheer arrangement,
right.
Not any physical properties that it has. And
can I stop you real fast? And just for the listener if you're out walking in the woods and you see a bunch of sticks that are arranged and says, stuck, help us.
Out, help.
Yeah. That, there wouldn't be anything against the laws of physics, like, oh no, those atoms could be like that. It's just, intelligence is involved here. And so that's the sense
Exactly.
in which, in the mere matter and energy per se, it's the arrangement, it's the information contained. And then that's the whole, thing of, so anyway, just to make sure they have something.
You can perceive that. And I think you can do it pretty rigorously. So there's references in the book if you want to look that up. And guys like William Dembski and Robert Marx and Werner Kett have kind of gone into some depth how you can quantify this, even in cases where, if you saw a word spelled out with sticks, but it was in a language you don't speak, you would still know.
Right.
Even if you don't understand the message, you know that it is a message. And Lockean homesteading, in a way, kind of presupposes this. If you're going to look at a piece of land and say, is this in the state of nature or has it been transformed? How can you tell? You have to be able to perceive, okay, there's some organization here which comes from intelligent intent. And so there's a difference between a forest and a garden. They're both, at one level, they're just some land and plants, but one's been organized, one's been laid out into a particular arrangement to be pleasant, the garden, whereas the forest is just, as it grew in nature. And increasingly, I started to think about, what is production, right? In the economic sense, we don't make anything new. Only God makes things out of nothing. Only God creates ex nihilo, to use the theological term, out of nothing. People don't do that. They just rearrange existing matter. So in a sense, all economic production is expending energy upon matter to impose information. That's what economic production is. And as I thought that through, that leads to some really interesting kind of implications. One of which is it kind of explains part of, why don't people who own a whole bunch of land, why don't they just dominate the economy? Why aren't farmers massively the wealthiest people in the economy? Because they have so much land and we can't make more of it, right? How come they don't dominate the wealth system? And the reason is because really there's not that much information that's gone into that land. There's some definitely, like, maybe they've laid out pipes for irrigating and that sort of thing. But, I'm looking at you through a smartphone as my webcam right now. It's tiny relative to the size of a farm, but there's so much information densely packed into that small piece of material. And it's really the information that represents the economic wealth in a very real way.
Yeah, I thought of that too.
So that explains why.
Sorry, the last thing you just hit on there. I've had thoughts of that too. Like, if you see a worker going into a big factory and they have steel and glass and then cars come out the other end of the pipeline, you understand that. But like Stephen King sits down at his computer to type a best-selling novel, and he's working all day, and like there's nothing physical. It's like he rearranged the zeros and ones inside of his hard drive or whatever. And yet there's a sense in which you can see, whoa, look at what he just created, this amazing novel. And, and so it's clearly the information that he's done there. It's not like, what did you physically do? And like you say, everything, even farmers, because this is like certain economic doctrines, like the physiocrats and whatever, or there's this idea that advertising isn't really productive, whereas, manufacturing is. And from an economic, subjective value viewpoint, those are arbitrary. Even farmers, like you say, they don't actually create anything out of nothing. They rearrange matter. So yes, it's the influx of information is one way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and when you take that a step further and you get into the kind of Rothbard's idea that you have self-ownership, you're just immediately at birth given ownership of your body. You have instantly control of eyes and the mouth and hands and these kind of things. Okay, God kind of gives you from the outset enough matter that you control that you can then start doing production. All you need to make information is the mind, and you have hands, you can impose it on material, you can start doing production. And it's kind of this, it's almost like an insurance policy against monopoly. Right? Anyone can do production. You really don't need other stuff. You have everything you need to start coming up with information and imposing it on matter. And that partly explains why we don't just gravitate into total monopoly over time, without the imposition of violence. It's normal that everyone would keep producing and there'd be kind of harmony and our interests would be aligned. I'm really picking up on that idea from Bastiat of economic harmony.
Right. Huh. Okay. Yeah. So I guess I was gonna say I haven't read Locke in a while. I don't even know if I ever really did read the original. I probably did, just like at least the passages about the homesteading stuff.
Locke's second treatise. It's not that long. It's one of the first things I read when I started the thesis.
So, but just to see like how much of it, because the way like we think of it is, he said you got to transform the land, right? And so then that does raise the question of, well, transform it how? And and so is this true that, are you saying someone who comes upon it, do they need to recognize, like, I guess at the very least, just to be able to prove it, right? Because if I came along and I said, oh, I homesteaded this forest 10 years ago, and someone said, I don't see any evidence of that. I said, no, you see how there's leaves on the trees? I did that. You could say, no, that
there is this,
trees normally
there's this
naturally
difficult case of kind of abandoned land, or land that was homesteaded, but has since been left so alone that it's kind of been overgrown again. And is that back in a state of nature? You might say so. And I think Rothbard deals with some of the practicalities of that, and like how you might have, a system of title searches. And there's no reason why homesteaded property should revert to the state of nature if someone still knows that, if you have a record of who homesteaded it, there's no reason why it should just revert just because they're not happening to use it right now.
Right.
I think that's fair. But on the other hand, if it reverts to what looks like a state of nature and no one is claiming it anymore, then it should be free to be rehomesteaded.
But even there, it still fits your thesis that there's the information involved, right? In other words, show me an arrangement of atoms to prove that you homesteaded. Yeah, this title right here that's in the courthouse. You see what I'm saying? Like, the atoms of the ink on this piece of paper or whatever. And so that is the evidence, flowing through history of my original intervention. And you're right too. We're getting real philosophical here in meta. There's a sense in which, I was just thinking this the other day. You know how like in the Disney movies there seems to be this contrast between man and nature, and so on one, you know what I mean? Like it's like, oh, Bambi, everything's great in Bambi, all the animals are cool, but man comes along and it's like, well, wait a minute, we're part of nature too. But yet that actually is a compliment, even though in the movies man is cast as ominous and this threat to good nature.
Yeah.
Yet it's almost like a compliment. Like we're so, you know what I mean? Like it's almost acknowledging the Bible saying that we have dominion, that there is a words, what we do, like in other words, when environmentalists worry about recycling and stuff like that, and they say, oh, because man-made products don't biodegrade, and there's a sense in which, well, everything we make, isn't that just nature? You get what I'm saying? And yet there does seem to be a qualitative difference. Like we know what people mean if they see a plastic bottle on the ground and say, oh man, look what we did. We spoiled nature with that. And so, but it's where I'm going with this is what you're saying that kind of fits that, like human agency or intelligence doing things out in the world, like it leaves its mark. And so that's kind of what maybe one way of seeing it.
And so one of the kind of where I go with that in the chapter is, I think in a Rothbardian society where we had competing private courts, one of the things that the courts should do is apply some of these ideas from intelligent design theory to determine where property boundaries should be in cases where it's a bit subtle. So for instance, I think one of the examples I gave was if you plant a row of trees, if you leave them a meter apart so that you don't totally overwhelm the soil. But is that, that meter of dirt in between, it's kind of technically unchanged. Is it still in a state of nature? Can someone else come and homestead it? And my answer is, well, no, because you can see that there's been an intelligent choice to leave that empty. It's been left empty with purpose. And so that, in that sense, it has been homesteaded. Information has been imposed on that larger area and deliberately left some of it fallow with no tree planted. And, a judge in a Rothbardian society should take note of that and say, no, that's not available for homesteading. It's trespassing if you try to take that. And so that even answers one thing I really struggled with. My dad's a big hiker. He really likes the idea of being out, in the wilderness, out in the bush, as we would say in Australia. And I thought, can there just never be a nature reserve? Is that just a thing that can't exist in a Rothbardian private property society because it's always able to be homesteaded? There's, the problem
Right.
we have now really is that the Crown in Australia, the Queen, effectively just says, no, that bit of forest that's totally untouched, it's mine. No one's allowed to build anything there. Deal with it. And in a Rothbardian society, you don't have that, so can we never have a nature reserve? And I kind of thought about it for a while and thought, well, no, you could definitely set up a nature reserve. You just have to set it up in such a way that it's very clear for the sake of the courts who would have to argue over it, that this has been left in pretty close to the state of nature on purpose.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so a great example you might come up with is like Central Park in New York, Hyde Park in London. If you took a particular square meter of Central Park, it might look an awful lot like it's in the state of nature.
Right.
But taken as a whole, the whole city around it, it's very clear that this area has been left to be a park and not to just be more high-rise. That's been done on purpose.
Right. And that phrase really is at the heart of idea. It was on purpose. It was designed. It was, there's intentionality involved.
Exactly.
And that's the whole thing with human action, like the phrase human action. Mises is talking about, praxeology to say it's not just bodily motions. Like if we're going to attribute intentionality and purpose to this bag of cells blobbing around, then we say, oh, that's a human action. There's purpose involved. So
yeah, absolutely.
So I'm just saying these notions of like mere matter and motion, and then. Or it's like the mind-body problem and all. So a lot of this stuff, it does seem to come down to it's not just matter and energy, but information, and that like information implies the existence of minds. How do you feel about that? Right?
Yeah, definitely.
So
yeah, absolutely. So this is, if you want a $2 word, it's the teleological argument for the existence of God.
Right.
There is information in the universe, and it must come from a mind, and that mind is God. In very, very short form.
Well, sure. I mean, so that's where ultimately where I go. But I'm just saying to call something information, if there were no minds, not God's mind, but just in general, to even talk about information means there must be a mind in principle capable of perceiving it.
Yeah.
Well, we covered a lot of material, a lot of deep concepts in this episode. We're wrapping down the time we had allocated for it. Is there anything else you want to say as final words in terms of people who are? Is this all in the one book, or are these separate things you've written?
This is all in the one book. The book is pretty large. It's about 400 pages. So it is pretty solid. I'll put the warning out there to anyone who wants to get into it. I wrote it trying to write the book that I wished had been in the Bible College library. So I didn't shy away from saying technical things. I didn't shy away from using Greek and Hebrew words, any of that kind of stuff. So it's readable if you don't have the theological background. You can get through it, but it's, think of it as a kind of a book targeting people with at least an academic bent.
Okay, great. And so I'm just looking at it now. Is it just available at the link you sent me, the Being Biblical one, or is it also at regular?
Yeah.
It's just there. Okay, so I'll make sure.
So you can get it on Amazon and Book Depository and all those things.
Oh, you can get it there too.
Yeah, it's at my website.
Okay.
Yeah, It's at my website, beingbiblical.com. I got a free ebook there as well on the origin of the New Testament canon. So who chose the books of the Bible? That one's free. Yeah, go ahead and check those things out. Also, you get a discount if you pay with crypto because agorism.
Yeah, great. So, folks, the book title is Taxation is Slavery, The Biblical Case for Libertarian Politics. My guest has been Nick Watts, and all of the links, folks, for all this stuff is at bobmurphyshow.com/179. Fascinating discussion, Nick. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Your stuff, your podcast stuff and things you've written have been hugely influential on me kind of getting through all this wrestling. So hugely appreciative. A big fan. Thank you for all the hard work you put in over many years.
Oh, I appreciate that. And thanks. This book sounds great. I'm sure you'll get a lot of interest in it.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.